Christmas Eve car trouble. It was Christmas Eve, and I was driving back from the office, still reeling from the last-minute chaos of wrapping up end-of-year reports. The snow was falling thick, covering the roads in a slippery, powdery mess that made driving feel like navigating an ice rink. My usual route was eerily quiet, with most people already home celebrating with their families. I was craving nothing more than to get back to my warm apartment, curl up with a cup of cocoa, and pretend the stress of work didn't exist. As I rounded a bend, I spotted a car pulled off to the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking like a distress signal in the growing darkness. A man stood next to it, waving his arms frantically. He looked desperate, bundled up in a heavy coat, a scarf wrapped tightly around his face. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. I rolled down the window just enough to hear him over the whirring heater. "Hey, I'm stuck. Can you give me a hand?" "The engine's dead, and my phone battery's out," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. He sounded normal enough, but something about the situation made my stomach twist. Still, it was Christmas Eve, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who left someone stranded in freezing weather. Reluctantly, I parked behind his car and stepped out, bracing against the sharp wind that bit at my face. "What's wrong with it?" I asked, eyeing his car warily. He gestured toward the hood, mumbling something about the battery, and I bent down to take a closer look. That's when I noticed the way he was standing. Too close, too tense. A chill ran through me, and not just from the cold. I should have trusted my instincts. As I crouched by the car, pretending I knew the first thing about engines, I felt him move behind me, fast. Before I could react, I heard the crunch of snow and felt his hands grip my shoulders, shoving me toward the open trunk of his car. Panic surged through me like a live wire. I fought against him, kicking back and twisting as hard as I could, but he was strong. "Stop fighting, it's not what you think," he hissed, his voice suddenly cold and unrecognizable. "Not what I think." My mind was racing with every worst-case scenario imaginable. Adrenaline took over, and somehow, I managed to slam my elbow into his gut. He let out a sharp grunt, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy ice scraper from his trunk. Without thinking, I swung it wildly, catching him on the side of his head. He staggered, cursing, and for a split second, I thought about running. But I couldn't just leave him there. I scrambled to my car, fumbling for my phone with trembling hands. As soon as I dialed 911, I locked my doors and kept the engine running, ready to drive off if he came after me again. Through the frosted windows, I saw him clutching his head, his dark figure illuminated by the hazy glow of my headlights. He didn't try to run. Instead, he slumped against his car, breathing heavily, and stayed there until the police arrived. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting him to lunge at my car or pull out some hidden weapon. But he just stood there, staring into the snow like he was trying to piece together what had gone wrong. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold my phone, but I stayed on the line with the 911 operator, who kept assuring me that help was on the way. When the flashing red and blue lights finally cut through the swirling snow, I felt an overwhelming wave of relief. Two officers approached cautiously, their boots crunching in the snow as they assessed the scene. One of them gestured for me to stay in my car while the other approached the man, who still hadn't moved. What happened next felt surreal. The officer had barely started questioning him when the man suddenly lunged forward, trying to grab something from his pocket. I couldn't hear much from inside the car, but the officers acted fast, pinning him to the ground before he could do anything else. They secured his hands behind his back and pulled out a long knife from his coat. My stomach turned at the sight. If I hadn't fought back, if I'd hesitated for even a second longer. I shook my head, trying to block out the thought. The officer who stayed with me after the arrest asked a lot of questions. If I'd seen him before, why I'd stopped, how he'd tried to grab me. I answered as best I could, but my mind kept circling back to that knife. Who carries something like that on Christmas Eve? And what had he planned to do with it? After the police left with the man in cuffs, I stayed parked for a while, too shaken to drive. The snow had piled up thick around my tires, and the thought of getting stuck out here again made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head, the way he'd grabbed me, the weight of the ice scraper in my hands, the glint of the knife. It felt like some kind of warped nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Eventually, one of the officers came back to check on me, knocking on my window and startling me so badly I almost screamed. He told me the man had a record, a history of similar incidents, though none had escalated this far. Apparently, I was lucky I got away. Lucky. The word felt so hollow as he said it. I drove home in a daze, gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I finally got inside my apartment, the warmth didn't comfort me like I thought it would. Every little noise made me jump, the heater clicking on, the hum of the fridge, even my neighbor's muffled footsteps above me. My phone buzzed with a call from my parents, wishing me a Merry Christmas, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. How could I? The world didn't feel the same anymore. I'd always thought of Christmas Eve as magical, a time for cozy lights and soft music. Not this. As I sat there in the silence, staring out at the snow still falling outside my window, one thought kept echoing in my mind. What if I hadn't fought back? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there, hearing the crunch of snow as he crept closer, feeling his hands shoving me toward the trunk. I kept the ice scraper I'd used on him next to my bed, as if that could protect me from something like this ever happening again. The police had assured me they'd keep me updated, but I didn't really want to know more. What could they say that would make me feel safe? The man had planned something horrible, and I'd walked straight into it because I wanted to be a good person on Christmas Eve. I kept wondering how many others he might have hurt, and how close I'd come to being another statistic. In the days that followed, the world seemed to move on like nothing had happened. People were out shopping for post-Christmas sales, chatting about New Year's plans, but I felt disconnected, like I was watching it all through a pane of glass. The snow had started to melt, but every time I saw a stranded car on the side of the road, my chest tightened and my hands started to shake. I wish I could say I've found some closure, that I've moved past it, but the truth is, I haven't. That night changed something in me. I used to think I could spot danger, that I'd know when something was wrong. Now I realize how easy it is to miss the signs until it's too late. Christmas Eve at CVS. I never thought working a late shift at CVS on Christmas Eve would leave me with a memory I'd never forget, and not in a good way. I just turned 18 a few months before and was picking up as many shifts as I could for extra cash. The store was dead that night, as you'd expect. Most people were at home with their families, not wandering the aisles of a 24-hour pharmacy. It was just me and another coworker, Jen, but she'd been stuck in the stockroom sorting out a shipment most of the night, leaving me out front. The quiet was eerie in a way I hadn't noticed before. No carolers outside, no Christmas music playing in the background, just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional beep of the automatic doors. Around 10:30, I started to think the rest of my shift would just drag on like this, uneventful and quiet. That's when he walked in. At first, I didn't pay much attention. People still came in for last-minute things, even on holidays. But there was something off about him right away. He was wearing this long, oversized coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in years, and his face was gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days. His eyes darted around the store as he shuffled toward the back, his movements jerky and uneven. When he passed the counter, I got a whiff of this sour metallic smell that made my stomach turn. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just down on his luck, looking for something small to buy. But then, he didn't go for the shelves. He just stood in the middle of the aisle, facing the corner, completely still, like he was waiting for something. At first, I didn't know what to do. He wasn't doing anything wrong technically, but the way he stood there, not moving, not even pretending to browse, was unnerving. I cleared my throat and called out, "Let me know if you need help finding anything." My voice sounded too loud in the empty store, echoing in a way that made me wince. He didn't respond. He didn't even look at me, just stood there with his back to me, like he hadn't heard a thing. I felt my chest tighten, a weird kind of anxiety crawling up my spine. I tried to shake it off and went back to straightening the candy racks near the register, keeping him in my peripheral vision. After what felt like forever, he finally moved. Not toward the shelves or even the counter, though. He turned slowly, and I could see he was holding something small in his hands, cupped like it was precious or fragile. I couldn't make out what it was from where I stood, but he stared at it like he was mesmerized. Then, out of nowhere, he started mumbling. I couldn't catch the words, but the tone was low, guttural, and almost rhythmic, like he was chanting. My heart was pounding now. I glanced toward the stockroom door, hoping Jen would come out any second. I didn't want to be alone with this guy anymore. I tried to focus on my breathing and act normal, but my hands were shaking as I grabbed a few bags of candy to restock the display. When I looked up again, he was closer, much closer. He had moved to the end of the aisle nearest the register without making a sound, and now he was staring straight at me. His eyes were wide, almost bulging, and his lips were pulled back in a kind of smile that wasn't friendly at all. I froze, my mind racing. He was still holding whatever it was in his hands, clutching it like it was the only thing keeping him alive. I forced a nervous laugh and said, "Hey man, are you looking for something specific? We're closing soon." That was a lie. CVS didn't close, but I was desperate for some kind of normal interaction. He didn't answer, just kept staring. Then, he raised the object in his hands and tilted his head. It looked like a broken piece of a Christmas ornament, one of those cheap, glass ones. The jagged edges glinted under the fluorescent lights as he turned it slowly, almost like he was showing it off. "Pretty, isn't it?" he said suddenly, his voice raspy and soft, like he hadn't spoken in days. I didn't know what to say. My gut screamed at me to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were stuck to the floor. He took a step toward the counter, and I could see his hand gripping the sharp edge of the ornament hard enough to draw blood. Bright red drops hit the floor, but he didn't even flinch. I was on the verge of calling for Jen when he suddenly slammed the ornament piece onto the counter. The noise was sharp, like a gunshot in the quiet store, and I jumped back instinctively. He leaned forward, his bloodied hand still pressed against the counter, and whispered, "You should leave. It's not safe here." His breath smelled awful, a mix of decay and something bitter, and I could see beads of sweat on his forehead even though it wasn't warm inside. My mouth went dry, and I managed to stammer, I work here. Are you okay? Do you need help?" I regretted asking the second I said it. His face twisted into something between a smirk and a snarl, and he muttered, "It's too late for help." That was it. I didn't care if I looked rude or scared. I turned and bolted toward the stockroom. My sneakers squeaked against the linoleum, and I could hear him shuffling after me, faster than I expected. I slammed through the stockroom door and almost ran straight into Jen, who was coming out with a box in her hands. "What's wrong?" she asked, startled, but I barely had time to answer. The door behind me creaked open slowly, and I turned to see him standing there, his silhouette backlit by the store's harsh lights. He wasn't holding the ornament anymore, but his hands were clenched into fists, blood still dripping from his palm. His voice was louder now, almost gleeful. "I told you, it's not safe." Jen stepped in front of me before I could stop her, her tone sharp. "Sir, you need to leave, or we'll call the police." She was braver than I felt, but I could see her hands trembling as she spoke. He didn't react at first, just stood there staring at us like he was trying to decide something. Then, without warning, he lunged forward. Jen screamed, dropping the box she was holding, and I grabbed her arm, yanking her back with me toward the far side of the stockroom. He stopped short, just inside the door, his chest heaving like he was out of breath. "They're coming," he hissed, his eyes wild. "You can't stop them. Nobody can." That was it for me. I grabbed Jen's hand and pulled her toward the emergency exit at the back of the stockroom. I didn't care if the alarm went off or if the manager chewed us out later. I just wanted to get out. The guy didn't follow us right away, which somehow made it worse. As we pushed through the heavy metal door, I glanced over my shoulder and saw him standing there. His head tilted to the side like he was listening for something. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. Then the door slammed shut behind us, and the cold night air hit me like a slap. Jen was already fumbling for her phone to call the police, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely hold onto mine. The police arrived surprisingly fast, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. They searched the store and the surrounding parking lot, even checked the security footage, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. The footage only made things stranger. On the cameras, we could see him walking in, just like I remembered, shuffling, clutching that broken ornament, and heading to the aisle. But when it showed him standing still, mumbling to himself, there was no sound, no audio of his voice, just silence. And when he moved toward the counter, his movements looked jerky, almost unnatural, like a video glitch. Then, at the moment he came into the stockroom, the footage froze. Just froze. No static, no cutting out, just the same frame stuck there until the emergency door opened and Jen and I ran out. The cops didn't seem to know what to make of it. One of them suggested he was a drug addict or mentally ill, but that didn't explain the footage or the way he disappeared. They told us to lock up and call if we saw him again, but I could tell they didn't think much of it. After they left, Jen and I stayed outside, too shaken to go back in until the shift ended. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the way his eyes burned into me like he knew something I didn't. To this day, I avoid working late shifts, and I definitely don't go anywhere near a CVS on Christmas Eve.